All right, let's take you now, as we've been previewing, a build-up to the United Nations General Assembly this September in New York has begun in earnest as the world grapples with multiple crises, for the wars in Gaza, Ukraine and Sudan, to lagging implementation on the Sustainable Development Goals, while global temperature rises and the implications on climate change present an existential threat to the entire planet. Correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease is standing by for us with an exclusive discussion with the United Nations Secretary General António Guterres on these and other issues. Sherwin, a very good evening to you. Of course, the other issues would be a lot of the talk we've heard as the UN Secretary General calls for a reform, saying the continent is underrepresented.
Well, and Paul, a warm welcome to you and our viewers back home to the United Nations headquarters here in New York. Our location for this discussion is the Woodrow Wilson Reading Room, which is part of the United Nations Library Annex, which is adjacent to the UN Secretariat, where really all the action really happens here at UNHQ. And as we welcome the UN Secretary General António Guterres back to SABC News. Sir, always good to see you and to have this opportunity. Thank you. Let me begin with the breaking news out of Geneva today. The World Health Organization has declared Mpox a public health emergency in Africa, with fears the virus may still spill across borders, with calls for a coordinated international response. You have long called for increased pandemic readiness based on the lessons of COVID-19, but to quote you from December last year, quote, "We are not ready." What do you believe should happen now?
You'll allow me, before answering your question, to say that something very important happened for the first time this week in this General Assembly. And it was the session of the Security Council to correct the injustice, the appalling injustice of the absence of Africa in the permanent members of the Security Council and the low representation of Africa in the Security Council. Africa has been a double victim of colonialism. First, because of colonialism itself. Let's think about the transatlantic slave trade. But then a victim of colonialism, because when the institutions that rule the world today were created when many African countries were under colonial domination. And for the first time here, there was a consensus in the Security Council that this needs to be corrected, and that Africa must have the weight and the voice that corresponds to its reality in today's institutions. Coming back to the DRC. This is a great concern, and obviously we fully trust the World Health Organization, but we now need to make a huge effort of mobilization. Mobilization of the country itself and the region, but mobilization of the international community, because resources will be needed, capacities will be needed, and we need to bring quickly into the area all the instruments that are necessary to contain it, first of all, for the people not to suffer, and then for the disease not to spread, because that spread would be a disaster for the region that we need to avoid at all costs.
In the last 4 years, we've had COVID-19, growing climate emergencies, the wars in Ukraine, Sudan, and Gaza. The UN Charter, often reduced to words on paper, violated with impunity, without repercussions or redress. The future simply does not look bright for too many in too many places, Secretary General. When will the reset come, and how can it be guaranteed given the perilous state we find the world today?
Well, we need to recognize that the institutions that were created after the Second World War, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions and many others, those institutions were adapted to a world that no longer exists. The world today is different. It has changed dramatically. So these institutions need to adapt to the challenges of today's world. We have now geopolitical divisions that were not conceived at the time. We have now a multiplication of conflicts with different kinds of weapons that were not available at the time. We have now climate change. We have artificial intelligence. We have an enormous inequality in the world, dramatic injustice in relation to the allocation of resources, financial, economic resources all over the world. And so these institutions need to be reformed. We need the reform of the United Nations, including the Security Council. We need the reform of the Bretton Woods institutions. We need the reform of all other organizations of our multilateral system, to adapt those organizations to the world of today and to create the instruments that are necessary to face those challenges that you mentioned. That's the reason why we are so deeply engaged now in the preparation of the Summit of the Future, and so hopeful that member states will understand that things really need to change.
I'm glad
and it's not enough to approve another document, another paper with some nice sentences. Things really need to change. Power relations need to change to adapt to the realities of today. Resources need to be distributed in a much more fair and equitable way, and we need to have a world in which people can believe in the institutions that were created to solve its problems.
You told the General Assembly in September last year that the world was becoming unhinged, geopolitical tensions were rising and global challenges were mounting, and that, quote, we seem incapable of coming together to respond, warning further that global governance was stuck in time. You mentioned the Summit of the Future, an effort to reset global cooperation. I wonder how the reality of today intersects with the aspirational nature of the Summit of the Future, and how, as you mentioned, do we ensure that this doesn't just become another exercise of getting something really great on paper, but that then lacks implementation?
Now, this is a very important moment. We still have a concentration of power in the world that corresponds largely to what the world was in the past. And we have in the global economy developed countries with a dominant role in all major economic institutions. Now, it is obvious that in between things have changed. New emerging economies are there.
Multipolarity.
At the same time, we see that the tremendous inequalities that were created are having dramatic impacts in the global south, if we still can speak about the global south with the distinctions that start to emerge there. It is clear that those countries that have today the power to be dominant in the institutions that run both politically, Security Council, and economically, Bretton Woods systems, the developed countries to understand that either they lead a transformation in which there is a redistribution of power corresponding to the realities of today's world, or inevitably we will witness the fragmentation of the institutions. Because the institutions need to be truly universal. The institutions need to represent the reality of the whole world as the whole world is today, and not as the world was after the Second World War.
So let me push you on that. Are you saying developing countries need to take power? Because if you just look at the IGN process, right, in terms of UN reform, Security Council reform, the 5 permanent members have the final say, essentially. They have veto. One country can essentially undermine the entire IGN process. So you're saying take the power, but the power lies with the 5, no?
But that's not the only question that matters. That is an important question. But of course, if you have more permanent members, and if you enlarge the Security Council to include other countries of other parts of the world, if at the same time you strengthen the role of the General Assembly in relation to the Security Council, as we are already starting to do, this will be an important change. But this is not the only reform that is needed. Look, for instance, when the special drawing rights were distributed, they were distributed to the rich countries.
Right.
And this was because of the rules that exist today. That's how the system was conceived. We need to have a system conceived in a way in which when we create wealth or resources out of nothing, we do it in a way that is much more equitable. So the questions of power are not only in the Security Council, the questions of power are in the international financial institutions, the questions of power are in many of the instruments that were created to regulate global trade, global technology, and to look seriously into how we can make those institutions represent the reality of today's world. And the truth is, developed countries are still today in a dominant position because of the dimension of their economies, so they are in a position to reform the institutions and still keep a very important role, which is much better than keep the control of institutions and at the same time see those institutions becoming not universal, but because of the fragmentation that inevitably will occur, representing then a much more narrow part of the world.
Let's talk a little bit about the international rules-based system. The Security Council has met 24 times in emergency sessions on the catastrophe in Gaza. You, Secretary General, used the rarely invoked Article 99 that allows the Secretary General to bring a matter of peace and security to the Council's attention. South Africa has used the Genocide Convention to haul Israel before the International Court of Justice that has handed down clear provisional measures that to the naked eye simply have not been implemented. Ceasefire talks have dragged on for months without resolution. What message does that send to the people of Gaza?
Well, first message is that the rulings of the International Court of Justice must be obeyed. Institutions must be taken seriously.
But they're not.
The rule of law must prevail. The Charter must prevail. International law, international humanitarian law must prevail. Which means that it's absolutely essential to make sure that the international community mobilizes itself to guarantee that what we are witnessing today in Gaza, with the massive destruction of Gaza and with the largest number of civilian casualties of any crisis that I've witnessed, that ends, that a ceasefire takes place, and that is the beginning of a two-state solution that is the only possible way to allow for Israelis and Palestinians to live together in peace. This is an objective that must be in the center of the action of the United Nations, and by the way, it's an objective that fully corresponds to the advice that was given by the International Court of Justice, considering that the occupation was not lawful.
Correct, yeah. The United States is a key mediator to this conflict, along with Qatar and Egypt. And while the Security Council was meeting yesterday on the school strike that killed around 100 people in Gaza City, news emerged from the Pentagon that the United States had approved a $20 billion arms package to Israel. Is that acceptable in your view? Negotiating a ceasefire while at the same time arming one of the main protagonists in this conflict to the hilt?
Well, there is a very old tradition of alliance between the United States and Israel. What matters for me now is that the United States uses that alliance to make sure that Israel abides by international law.
Hamas said it would not take part in the new round of ceasefire talks in Doha starting tomorrow, Thursday. What's your understanding of who is really responsible for the lack of agreement and what that might mean in terms of regional escalation, given the posture we are seeing from Iran and Hezbollah in the aftermath of the assassinations of some of their leaders by Israel?
For the moment, what's important is that there is an agreement. And I still hope that an agreement is possible. And I still hope that both sides will understand that it's absolutely essential to have a ceasefire in Gaza immediately. It's a matter of, I would say, interest for the international community, for peace globally, but it's vital for the people in Gaza that is suffering tremendously, and it's vital for the people in Israel to create the conditions for a solution in which Israelis can also live in full security in their own country. So my objective today is not to start blaming any of the parties. My objective today is to say, come, agree, implement the ceasefire, and create with that the conditions for a new era in which we can finally hope for a solution for the Middle East crisis.
Which I imagine is a similar argument you'll use in terms of the warring parties in Sudan, right? The US has facilitated Sudan's ceasefire talks that started in Geneva today in an effort to end the 16-month conflict there, which appears to be boycotted by both the RSF and the SAF, so both warring sides, while, as we all know, the famine conditions have taken root in the regions around Al Fasher and North Darfur. What must be done, Secretary General, and by whom, to give these two generals the message that this war cannot continue?
I think that we are witnessing in Sudan the combination of two factors. First, a struggle for power between two generals that completely neglect the interests of their own people. Second, a clear interference of a number of countries that consider that Sudan is very important and that wants to have a role, which of course complicates inevitably the situation.
Which countries are those? United Arab Emirates, perhaps?
Some countries support one side, some countries support another. The problem is now not to make a list, because the list probably would be incomplete. The problem is that we need to end external interference. And we need to put everybody together, putting pressure on these two generals to make an agreement, to make a ceasefire, and then to make an agreement that allow, with the support and the involvement of the civil society, to go back to the process of democratic transition. Now, there are some important things that have happened recently. We have now together the UN, the AU, the Arab League, IGAD and the European Union with the same strategy and with the same commitment. The second meeting took place in Djibouti, and we are united on doing everything we can to end this war. We had ourselves a meeting, as you know, with both the SAF and the RSF, trying to come to an agreement on humanitarian aspects and the protection of civilians. The SAF has not yet made any engagement. The RSF made a number of important engagements, and there will be a monitoring mechanism to see if those engagements are implemented. There is this initiative now of the United States, of the Saudi Arabia and of Switzerland, of this meeting where until now at least the SAF has not been present. But we need to bring all these things together, and that was the objective of the retreat that was made in Djibouti, in which we had the 5 organizations I mentioned and 40 countries, to all come together and understand that there are no specific interests of one country or another that matter when we see such a tragedy in Sudan, and when we see the dramatic impact of that tragedy in relation to the neighbors.
Let me ask you about the DRC. South Africa, as you well know, has troops in the DRC as part of MONUSCO's Force Intervention Brigade, and then, of course, as part of the SADC force, SAMI DRC, operating in the east. MONUSCO, as you well know, is currently engaged in a phased withdrawal, Secretary General. A tenuous ceasefire between the DRC and Rwanda is being implemented. But there's also been this irrefutable evidence of Rwanda's support for the rebel group, the M23. How do you expect the situation to evolve moving forward?
I must say that my view is that there must be African leadership in relation to the solution of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it is with a very positive attitude that we see the involvement of SADC. I don't think that a peacekeeping operation is what the DRC needs. There is no peace to keep in the DRC. Peacekeeping operations were designed in other times for other purposes. And we now need to have peace enforcing and counter-terrorism operations. That is the reason why we fought, and finally we won here in the Security Council, getting the approval of a resolution that allows the UN to support African Union-led operations and to finance 75% of those operations with assessed UN contributions. And I believe this is the future. The future is to have African operations supported by the UN and addressing the problems that exist in the continent. In the DRC, I think this is the moment to consolidate the ceasefire that was obtained. I think this is the moment to progressively look into how we can make a transition into the presence of MONUSCO, into a presence of an African force. SADC is, of course, the one that is directly involved, that can help not only address the problems between Rwanda and the DRC, but there are many other problems that have to be addressed. The ADF, the terrorist group that operates further north, and all the different armed groups of the DRC, of Rwanda, the FDLR.
ADF from Uganda. ADF from Uganda.
And from Uganda. I mean, that have created in that area an absolute mess that needs to be corrected. And I trust that we are now on the right track. What we need is to make sure that we pursue that track consistently until the end.
Our time is limited, so let's see how far I can get here, Secretary General. I don't need to tell you that 2023 was the hottest year on record, and we are on track for climate calamity. Quoting from you in June this year, in the case of climate, we are not the dinosaurs, we are the meteor. We are not only in danger, we are the danger. What needs to happen, and what needs to happen fast?
Well, things are moving very fast in two directions. They are moving very fast with climate change. And let's not forget that 85% of the emissions come from fossil fuels. But things are also moving very fast from the technological point of view. We see it with the huge investment in renewable energy. We see with electric cars proliferating. The problem is that the positive actions are moving much more slowly than the negative ones. And so we need to revert this trend of the two speeds. We need to be much quicker in climate action, and we need to be much more effective in the phase out of fossil fuels, much more effective in the preservation of our forests, much more effective in all the measures that would allow the emissions to be drastically reduced until 2030 as the way to guarantee that the 1.5 degrees limit is not
breached,
put into question at the end of the century. There might be overshooting for a moment, for a short period. I think it's likely that with all the nonsenses that have done in the past, we might have that overshooting, but we must act very strongly in order to make sure that that overshooting is short and is very limited, and that we move back to the 1.5 degrees, and that we move back to net zero emissions in 2050.
You stopped me a few months ago in the UN corridor to ask me about South Africa's government of national unity, while negotiations were at the time still ongoing. It's in many ways shaken the foundations of the political status quo that has been overwhelmingly dominated by the African National Congress since Nelson Mandela became the country's first democratically elected president in 1994. What are your observations on where South Africa finds itself today, some 30 years after apartheid?
My observation is an observation of trust in the South African people. South Africa came out of the apartheid, one of the most horrible violations of human rights in the world, and was able to do it in unity. Now we have a government that, to a certain extent, translates that unity in a political formula. I think that we need to trust that whatever the choice made by the South African people, South Africa will be on the right track, and South Africa will play a leading role in the modern world.
Final question for you. Are you watching the US election closely? You've had some experience with one of the candidates as president. Do you have a preference?
The UN does not interfere in the elections of any country. But the one thing that needs to be recognized, probably this election will be the most important political question that will happen until the end of the year.
Secretary General, as always, thank you so much for making time, and I certainly appreciate this conversation with you.
It was a pleasure.
The Secretary General of the United Nations, António Guterres, in conversation with us here at the UN Library Annex, adjacent to the Secretariat, in conversation on a variety of topics and certainly a lot of food for thought and possibly some consideration before everybody in South Africa goes to bed tonight. Thanks so much for tuning in. It's back to you in Johannesburg.
Absolutely. Some food for thought indeed, and some thought-provoking responses there